we have Running Center Symposium on March 18th and 19th on religious perspectives on civil life. It's always struck me that sort of two things have tended to happen in the 20th century around this matter. One is that religious communities themselves sometimes turn inwards and forsake the public world. And another thing that happens is that in some societies, religious communities are shoved out of the public world. And yet, the great religious traditions of the world have given a great deal of thought to the public and civil dimensions of life. So we're really pulling that forward. And we're bringing colleagues here from Singapore and Turkey, Bahrain, depending on what happens over there. I mean, it's amazing to see what's unfolding. As well as a number of other colleagues here. So here in Edmonton, there will be three perspectives mainly that are brought to the table. It is a symposium. It's on Friday and Saturday. So there'll be 3 speakers in the morning, 3 in the afternoon on those days from different traditions. And lots of opportunity to sit and talk and think together about it. Then, for those of you who may be in Calgary, on the 21st and 22nd, we will be doing something similar, but with different traditions at the table at Calgary. Here in Edmonton, it's going to be at the King's University College, mainly because parking is easy and you can usually find the place. And in Calgary at St. Mary's University College. So there's a little brochure here for any of you that might be interested. It doesn't cost anything except, you know, a little tumble with your ideas, which is pretty costly in many cases. So I invite you to come. I hope some of you can.
Very good. All right. Now, I think we're ready to go ahead here. I want to introduce our Animateur for today. It's Professor Don Carmichael from the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta. Don has specialized in political theory, which in the philosophy department we call political philosophy. And he's both in the contemporary area, worked a lot on roles, people like that, and also does a lot in the history of political thought, specializing especially in Hobbes and Aristotle. So today he's going to inspire our minds here with some remarks on this topic of just how much freedom of choice is needed to lead an excellent life. Don.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me? I'm not used to speaking with a microphone, so can you hear me back there? Okay. Is that all right? Is that better? Okay, thanks. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to take part in this series. I've been to a couple of them. I did some in the old days when they were down at the public library, and they were really interesting, and I've been to 2 this term so far, and they were both fascinating. So it's really an honor to be invited to be an animateur in the session. And in that connection, I most particularly want to thank and congratulate Professors Goa and Tweedale for the series itself. For the kind of things that I care about, this kind of series is fundamentally important. There doesn't begin to be enough of this kind of gathering, talk, conversation on things that matter in our community. So I think they're doing the community and each of us a tremendous service. Well, with a topic like this, how much freedom of choice do we need to live excellent lives? And in a series called Philosophers Café, it's, I guess, incumbent on me to start with some philosophers. I'm not going to say much about them. I'm going to suggest that maybe they're not very useful for us, but because I think they'll be in some people's minds, I'll just start by saying the natural contrast on an issue like this would be, say, Plato and John Stuart Mill. With Plato, you can read all of Plato's works and never see the expression freedom of choice. You rarely see the word freedom, and I don't recall, although there are people here who could correct me, that the word choice figures there. What Plato stressed was wisdom, harmony, balance. And he felt that to achieve those, you had to have the right kind of education and the right kind of society, a society that would privilege truth above all else and would minimize distractions. And there are kinds of distractions that are promoted today in the name of freedom of choice would, in his view, be really just distractions or worse. In fact, he took the view that freedom of choice was important, at least it was important in the eyes of people whom he thought were basically stupid. But for anyone else, it wasn't important. Now with Mill, on the other hand, and those of you who remember him as the great apostle of freedom and liberty, famously holding that each person should have complete sovereignty over their lives and actions, and there should be no restrictions of any kind in a person's conduct unless that conduct threatened directly to harm the interests of other persons. We hear a lot about that when people talk about freedom and freedom of choice. We hear a lot about Mill in that connection. We don't so often hear about Mill's reasons for that. And Mill's fundamental reason for valuing freedom and freedom of choice was he thought it was necessary for the flourishing of genius. Mill was really concerned about genius. Well, I'm sure there are geniuses here today, but I'm not one of them, and I suspect most of you aren't. And so I just want to say, having made that ritual bow in the direction of my masters, Plato and Mill, I'm going to leave them behind because I think they really don't have very much to say when it comes to the question of excellent lives as they might be lived by ordinary people. I hold the view, at least I believe and hope, that genuinely, deeply excellent lives can be lived by people who aren't geniuses or geniuses of philosophy. So how does that work? Well, I want to start with a couple of distinctions. I really don't have very much to say, but what I do have to say is some remarks of puzzlement, because I'm frequently puzzled when people talk about freedom and freedom of choice. So I want to start with a kind of puzzle I had about the title. The title of today's session is, How Much Freedom of Choice Do We Need to Live Excellent Lives? But if you think about it, that's not quite the... I mean, I was puzzled when I was looking at that, because it wasn't quite the title I was expecting. I thought the title would be, How Much Freedom, not freedom of choice, do we need to live excellent lives? It might seem a small point, but it's a large point for me. If we think about how much freedom do we need to live excellent lives, that invites us to think about freedom in a very broad way, including especially internal freedom, the kind of freedom of a fully developed, rich personality that is living an authentic and engaged life. If, on the other hand, we talk about freedom of choice, I think we rather quickly start thinking about the choices that a person can make and how many of them there are. And so we're swept into thinking about how many alternatives and choices does a person have to have in order to lead an excellent life. So I just want to declare my view on this at the outset. If we think about how much freedom does a person need to live an excellent life, I would say a lot. It's hard to imagine an excellent life that wasn't a life that truly expressed what was best in that person. But if we ask the question, how much freedom of choice does a person need to live an excellent life? I'd say, I don't know, and I don't care. I think it's actually kind of a dumb question. It's a little bit like asking how many television sets do you need to lead an excellent life. And I know that will be a little peculiar, but so let me explain why, just in terms of a couple of distinctions. I want to draw three broad distinctions about freedom. And the first is, when it comes to choices, the first is between the quantity of the choices and their quality. Last year at this time, in fact, exactly on this day, my wife and I were on sabbatical in New York City. And in the place where we were living, well, it had television sets, a lot of them. And one day, I turned on the TV set to see what kind of channels they had. And I flipped through the channels, I stopped at when I got to 201. I think there were a whole lot more. There was, for example, a 24/7 rosary channel. This consisted of 3 people standing together in the cold saying the rosary. And I guess so if you wanted to say the rosary in company, you would have that. And I can see that would be a valuable service for a lot of people. They had like 15 football channels and so on. Well, I mention this because this was in New York City, for heaven's sakes. We turned the TV on twice in 6 weeks, right? We didn't need 200 channels. We didn't need a TV at all. Well, because we had music, theater, bistros, bars, coffee shops, conversations, meditation classes, yoga, all that kind of stuff. We didn't need TV. So what's the virtue for us, or the advantage for us in having a whole lot of TVs in the house or 200 television channels? Now, that leads directly to an example that the great Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor used in one of his early works. He mentioned that he drew a contrast between the city of London and the city, I hope I say it correctly, Tirana, the then capital of Albania. Do you know the... Okay, the example is, he says, in London, there's a whole lot of churches and a whole lot of traffic lights. Every one of those traffic lights tells you you can't do something. It's a interference in your liberty. In Tirana, he said, there are no traffic lights and there are no churches. The question is, are people freer in Tirana than they are in London? In London, there seem to be all kinds of impediments or obstacles or interferences with people's freedom of choice. In Tirana, there are no interferences in people's choice. They just don't have many choices. And so that leads me then next to want to contrast between freedom of choice, which, whatever, and variety. I think if you want to see a place where there's immense freedom of choice but almost no variety, go to West Edmonton Mall. Right? I think they have something in excess of 35 shoe stores there, run by about 3 brands. They all sell the same shoes. Do those options amount to genuine variety in a way that enriches anyone's life? I think clearly not. So the final distinction on this that I want to draw is, and I think this one is important. At least I'm going to mention a play. Excuse me. I'm going to mention a play that suckers me a lot. I quite frequently get caught opposing coercion as if that meant the value of freedom. In other words, I take the view that restriction of choice and coercion is a bad thing. That doesn't mean that choice and freedom of choice is itself a good thing. It just means that oppression is bad. Right? Some of the main arguments for widespread freedom of choice appeal to the evils of oppression, but I think we can say that the oppression is bad without launching into an alternative. So, you may think I have thus far successfully avoided the question, which I have, but I'll turn to it now. How much freedom of choice does a person need to live excellently? The answer to that question, I think, has to depend on what you think is the excellent life. There have been a whole lot of sessions on that, and so I'm not going to say very much about that, except I'll just try to speak to it generally enough that you can fill it in any way you want in terms of how you regard the excellent life. But I want to contrast 2. One is the excellent life as the life that is chosen and full of choice. Just choose, choose, choose. I get up, I wake up in the morning, and I choose whether to get up, I choose what to put on, I choose whether to brush my teeth. Everything through my life is an affirmation of choice, and everything I do expresses that affirmation. That's one. The other life, there are lots of others, of course, but the other life, the one that I think of in terms of the life of excellence, is a life of the fulfillments that flow from the exercise and engagement of our best developed capacities. Now, I'm stating that kind of generally so you can fill in for yourself what those capacities might be. Like for me, the capacities would involve intellectual capacities, and the capacities for love, and the capacities for discrimination, and the capacities for movement. But fill them in any way you want. I just want to contrast those two. Because when we turn to the question, how much freedom of choice is required to live an excellent life, if you think, obviously, if you think of the excellent life in terms of the choice life, then the answer is a whole lot. But if you think of a life as a life of fulfillment that flows from the engagement and exercise of our best capacities, it's not obvious that any freedom of choice is necessary at all. At all. What is the case, I think, is that freedom of choice is kind of irrelevant. It's a little bit like asking how many television sets do you need to have a really fulfilled life. But now to suggest this, I want to conclude by taking a leaf from Martin Tweedale's book and his presentation back in January. I want to contrast three lives. And they're all lives that interest me, and they're all because they're lives of people I know or am. So the first is a life, I'm going to talk about two kids from one family and then their cousin. The two kids, one is John. It's a very traditional family, and we suppose it's a religious family. So just to cut it short, I'll suppose it's a Catholic family, but it could be any family that has that is itself religious from a tradition. It understands itself through time as having had those religious commitments. When John, who's the eldest, the firstborn, when John is born, when John's mother is pregnant, everyone is hoping that it'll be a boy, because the firstborn male in the family for generations unto generations has always been earmarked for the ministry or the priesthood. And so, lo, when John is born, out he pops. His mother's first thought is, a priest in the making. Now, somewhere around the time that John is 3, she teaches him some basic prayers, and he responds, the way that kids do, and she understands this, as do all the people around him, as a vocation. He goes to school, and they do religious things at the school, and he responds the way that, warmly, and the teachers say, a vocation in the making. John sails through primary and secondary school, and he graduates, and everyone thinks he's going to be a priest. And John does go to the seminary, and he lives the rest of his life as a priest, without, I want to suggest, really having thought a whole lot about it. Now, at another time, we could talk about whether John is making any kind of choice. We could talk about whether this is authentic. I don't want to get into that here. I just want to say it's tempting to say that John's life has been mapped out for him from the time that he was conceived, certainly from the time that he was born. The question I want to ask is, does that mean that John's life is not going to be an excellent life? I want to suggest that on the basis of everything I've told you so far, we have absolutely no reason at all for knowing whether his life is excellent or not. None. Now consider his sister, 2 years younger, and she has the advantage of being the second-born because she's freed from all this destiny stuff, right? So she can do or be whatever she wants. Somewhere in junior high, she develops an interest in caring for things and then starts thinking about nursing. She goes off to university and takes a nursing degree and practices her life as a nurse. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it. I'm not going to tell you whether she marries or is divorced or is ill or healthy or anything more. The question I want to ask you here is, Mary clearly has chosen her career in a way that possibly John has not. The question I want to ask you is, does that in itself suggest that Mary's life is a more excellent life? I want to say, not at all. Well, now let's suppose they have a cousin who comes from the same family tradition with the same traditions of the eldest, and, well, as things happen in these cases, just about the same time that John is born, his mother's sister gives birth to her firstborn, who's also a boy. But I'm going to call him a slightly different name. I'm going to call him My Way, as in the Frank Sinatra tune. That's just so we can keep them separate in any discussion we have. And the same thing happens with My Way. He's seen as a potential priest. At 3, he prays. At 5, he starts going to religious school, doing the sacraments, and everyone says, yes, he's going to be a priest, he's going to be a priest. And he gives no sign to anyone that that's not going to be the case. And then at 18, when he's going to go off to the seminary, he balks, chokes, and says, I can't do it. And then he needs some time. Right? What is it we say now? That he needs some time to come into himself or something like that. And comes back from a year away and lives the rest of his life as a ski instructor. In the course of which, if you want to make it worse, he not only falls in love with, but actually marries from among the bevy of beautiful women he meets on the ski slopes. He marries, let's say, a Protestant of some ferociously different kind. Now, all I want to ask you here about My Way is to compare him with his first cousin, John. Right? John didn't seem to go through choice, whereas My Way has really chosen his life. He's chosen his life by rejecting the life that was mapped out for him. Do you think that it's obvious that My Way has a better life? I'm inclined to think that if anything is obvious, the thing we'd have to start for is certainly noticing that there's a whole lot of turmoil and unhappiness going to be created in My Way's life. That's not to say it can't be an excellent life. I just want to say, for me, it's not obvious that any of these people have a better life. The question I would want to ask about every one of them is, are they doing valuable things with their lives? Are those valuable things making use of, engaging capabilities they have that are themselves worthwhile capabilities? If the answers to those two questions are yes, I'm inclined to say, yeah, they have excellent lives, whether they have freedom of choice or not. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Don. Now we'll go to the discussion, and as I said, once somebody starts on a topic, then we want other people to chime in on that topic. And we'll take them before other people who want to go on to another topic. All right, who would like to start on this interesting issue? Don has certainly taken up a position. Surely there's someone who would like to disagree with him.
Did I ruin it?
There's one over there.
Thank
you. It was a very thought-provoking talk that you gave. I do wonder whether...
It has to be close to your mouth.
Can't hear.
So we can hear.
Okay, now?
She said something nice.
Okay, I said something nice, thank you. I'm wondering if the example you gave of the person who didn't have choice, whether it's, like I wouldn't see that person as not having choice. He could have rejected the path that was put before him. I wonder if your discussion might be more challenged by, let's say, for example, a veiled woman who lives in a compound and can't leave her home at any time independently, whether her lack of freedom of choice might have some influence on her capacity to experience the more personal freedom that you spoke to, and which I agree with would be a very important component. But where do you see these two issues of freedom of choice and personal, I don't know, intellectual freedom or freedom to be the person you want to be inside? Where do you see those two things bumping into each other if we look at someone who truly doesn't have freedom of choice? And I'm not talking about a million televisions. I'm talking about fundamental freedom to education and movement and choices of who you marry and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm delighted you raised that, because it means we can have a riot today sooner than later. It's a really, it's a fundamentally important question, of course. I'm going to come at it, if I can. I'd like to say 2 or 3 things in answer to it. The first, just to take one thing out of play. In my experience, there's a premise in the example that I want to question. Many young people know from a fairly early age what it is, or the range of things they would like to do and be with their lives. Many young people don't, right? So that's the first thing I want to say is that is in itself an issue. And the second thing I want to remind you of, and I will come to the question you put in a moment, but the second thing I want to remind you of is the distinction I drew early on, that third distinction between the evil of oppression and the value of freedom of choice. For me, the denial of education in this case is not a denial of freedom of choice. It's a denial of education. And it's a denial of something that is very, very important. For me, up to a certain age, it doesn't matter whether people choose it or not. It has a value. And what I'm specifically trying to oppose in that is the view that I think we fall into, at least I fall into it a lot of the time, that what gives value to our pursuits is that we choose them. When, in the best cases anyway, we are drawn into those pursuits by their value. They speak to us and they call us to it. That's what falling in love is, with a person or with an activity. So, I want to try to where I'm going with this is 2 things. The denial of education in her case is evil. And secondly, the oppression is evil. I don't want to conclude from that apart from the oppression and the lack of education, there's anything else missing in her life. You see? I'm specifically not prepared to be drawn into the myth that we need choice, 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 and regimes which deny choices to people are on that account evil. I have for 40 years, I can't believe it, for 40 years I've taught at the university in my department. I teach a course that's required. Required. To political science students, right? I don't like teaching required courses. It just puts so much garbage in the way that you have to get through. But is there anything wrong with required courses? No, not in principle. So I appreciate that. I mean, I'm being frank. I'm sorry to drag it out so much, and I think we really should give the questioner a chance to knock the Jesus out of what I've said. Because I think it's a really important issue, yes.
Would you like to say something more to that?
No, I think my question is classified as depression, and I appreciate that aspect of it.
So I think that you've classified then the lack of choice as oppression, and I can see that, and I think that that's fair, and I do understand the point that you're making about this making equivalent freedom of choice with internal freedom. I guess I still question whether a certain amount of freedom of choice, where somewhere there's a margin where freedom of choice facilitates that personal freedom that you're speaking to. So.
And I'm with you. I have to say, I have never met a rule I liked. I really see a rule and I think it should be broken, but that's another matter. It's probably my neurosis.
Is someone over here?
I will. I wonder if we can get confused, I certainly am, with freedom, self-imposed, freedom, other-imposed, which is a huge difference.
Yep.
Now, if I'm in a situation where I have all the freedoms, unopposed by anybody else, then it only becomes my choice. Whereas in the other case, it isn't my choice. For example, here I can drink water out of a plastic bottle. There might be places in the world where you can't drink water out of anywhere, you've got to look for it. It's very hard to find, so they don't have that choice. So different choices can be imposed from within or without. Here, where these choices are not imposed from without, can still be imposed upon me from within. I can choose to do that. In order to make those choices, I must rely on my conscience. So the answer to the question to me seems to be, how much freedom do I need? Only that which my conscience can handle.
Yeah.
Should be the answer.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I agree. I don't want. Does that spoil it?
No. Right.
I think there's a distinction between choosing and then being able to do something or not. Now, I'm surprised that Martin, not making this point already, some philosophers, particularly in the Middle Ages...
A little closer, Richard, to yourself, thank you.
Okay, sorry. Duns Scotus, for example, writes the power to choose within our very being. So I can choose to do something I certainly will not do. So I'm free to choose, if you want to use the word freedom here, but whether I execute the choice or not depends upon society. I'm free to call somebody something very unpleasant. I don't do it because it would be rude. So there are other. So I don't think the freedom to choose is quite rightly focused at all.
I'd like to restate simply the point, because I think it's an important one, and also because it grows out of the last comment. So what it was Richard Bosley, who was formerly my senior at the university, was saying was that suggesting that I had defined freedom of choice too narrowly. And specifically, in drawing it, I had drawn if I could suggest this, too sharp a contrast between freedom that might be internal and freedom of choice that might be external. If you're going to cite Duns Scotus, or yourself for that matter, I agree. But I think when it comes to how freedom of choice is understood today generally, I think I was, if I may say it this way, I think I was more accurate. I do not think that the expression freedom of choice today is widely understood as indicating the kind of thing that would be an internal dimension that would be true even in the absence of no options. Now, if it's that kind of freedom that you want to talk about, of course that's important. That's fundamentally important.
No, but I didn't mean to make that point at all. I meant only to be talking about choice. Freedom is another matter altogether, and there are some things that are made free by the community and others are not. But choice seems to me to be separate from freedom rather than somehow tied in.
Well, and ideally it would be. What I'm suggesting is that I think that today the people who write newspapers understand choice in terms of the array of external alternatives, and they understand freedom of choice as how many of those alternatives there are and how much interference there is externally in what a person can do. There's precious little attention to the internal dynamics of being a free person, and precious little attention. I mean, the standard understanding of choice today is it's a simple election. It's not something that grows out of the person. It's not Aristotle's sense of prohairesis. It doesn't have to involve any deliberation, and it doesn't have to reflect any emotional or spiritual growth, right? Now, if we want to talk about all of those things, we want to say how much emotional and spiritual growth does a person require in order to lead an excellent life? Well, the answer is as much as possible. But my point, Richard, is, and I'm happy to be, nothing would make me happier at this point than to be wrong on this point. If I thought that my fellow citizens out there were fundamentally more concerned about the internal dynamics of being able to value things and being able to appreciate them and being able to live genuinely, deeply fulfilling lives. If they were more concerned about those things than they were about the array of external options they have, I would be ecstatic. I would be delighted.
All right, we have somebody in the back now. Tony.
You'll have to forgive me, Don, because I'm still caught in a bit of a time warp of the 1960s.
Well, I haven't seen you since then. How are you?
This is a great reunion, actually, so to speak. And I really enjoyed your presentation. So my questions are probably going to be quite predictable now that you've recognised who I am. But I'm taken back to Albert Camus' book, The Outsider, in which he describes a man facing capital punishment the next day, alone in his jail cell, knowing that he's going to be shot. And Camus makes the point that even though all freedom seemed to be taken from this guy, he has no choices left. But he does. He has the ultimate choice of how to dispose himself to the inevitability of his own extinction. And when I think about that, I think about, like, for example, women who have been trapped in abusive relationships, thinking that they were trapped, that they had no way out. But at some point in their life, realizing that they have been making unconscious choices to stay in these relationships, what I sometimes call recursive choices or mindless choices. Choices which are not recognized for what they really are, which are choices. And so I guess what I'm saying in a kind of roundabout way, I don't know what an excellent life means, but to use the words of the existentialists from the 1960s, an authentic life, as we probably would agree, involves reflexivity. It involves a sense of taking responsibility, being accountable for the choices that we make. And a life which is lived by taking mindless choices, by continuing to take choices which are never recognized as choices, in some ways is a lost life. You may say, well, the person can end up with wealth and riches and all sorts of things. That's possibly the case. But a life that is led without realizing that one is making choices is in some ways an impoverished life, I think. And maybe one would have to wait for that hypothetical deathbed realization that maybe comes to people, I don't know, not having experienced it. But that would be the time for someone to say, I took my life into my own hands, I was the mistress of my destiny or the master of my destiny, and I take responsibility for what I've done, rather than to have a sense my life unwound without my control. Because that would be a lie, because in Camus' sense we do have that ultimate control. So I guess this is a plea to recognize that we make choices all the time, even if we don't acknowledge it. And there's always a bit of a connection in my mind between that existential idea of authenticity and a Buddhist sense, actually, of mindfulness, because isn't that what the Buddhists are talking about? We should be mindful of every passing moment, which implies we are making choices, hopefully conscious choices. So I'm not sure if that's the recipe for an excellent life, but it is a recipe for an authentic one.
Are you just thinking and dreaming up a reply, or do you want me to go on to another?
Well, I think Tony and others, I mean, I have to say, everyone who's spoken has raised really important issues. So there were a couple of things that you said, Tony, with which I would disagree, but more quibbling, I think. And, you know, what do we call it? But I want to say, I would like to say one thing, just one thing, and it's an answer to everything that everyone has said so far. I come today as a guy who's a parent and as a grandfather, and who's spent, I can't believe it, but I've spent 40 years teaching political science students at the university. And you care about these people, and you care about the terms in which they understand themselves, and you understand their lives. And I look at how they're educated, by myself and my colleagues, as also by their high school, junior high, primary school teachers. And so, I'm not saying this to defend the kinds of remarks I was making at all. What I want to say just back to you, Tony, that I believe genuinely that these kids are being drilled in a way of thinking about themselves, whereby freedom for them does consist in having a certain kind of job that will give them a certain kind of income, that will enable them to purchase various things, one of which things they purchase is a certain control over the terms of their life and control over other people and freedom from unemployment and status. And what I see and hear in that list of things, I mean, and I'm not being sanctimonious with this, I'm not in any pulpit, I was that person once myself. But I look back at the person I was then and these kids now whom I really care for, and I wish I could help them. I wish I could just open the window a little bit on what I see as these false ways of thinking. So I'd love to put you right in front of those kids and say, you know, here, take L'Étranger. Look at this example. Read, this wasn't L'Étranger, sorry. But take Camus. Read this. Think about it. Think about what it would do for your life. Instead of, I'll tell you frankly, with these are kids who think that if we give them Camus, they want to see an overhead that will indicate what the important points are so that they can memorize them for an exam, so they will do well, so they will be on that circuit. Now, this is not to reply to the substance of what you said. I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, even if I don't agree in all details. But I wonder whether you wouldn't agree that, you know, we are now in a land that's rich with opportunity. Not opportunities for jobs, but rich for opportunities of ways of life and for the kind of freedoms that you and Richard were talking about. And we're not beginning to make use of them. I don't think as a society, in terms of our leadership, that we begin to understand what it would be to take advantage of those opportunities. So if you feel I have misrepresented freedom, I'm glad to be corrected, I guess. But I really do think we have to fight for these better and richer ways of understanding what a life can be, so that our kids can and our grandchildren can have those lives.
Yeah, I never had the courage to take you on, and I certainly don't have it now, so I'll try and find a way to agree with you. But at the same time, just in conclusion, I think that my plea for reflexivity in thinking about the choices that we make more consciously is really a recipe for not only a better personal life, but also potentially for better collective life. Because once we realize that the choices we make are choices, then we can start thinking about the ecological consequences, or the consequences for us as global citizens, in a way that we won't if those choices are simply seen to be default choices. So it really is a kind of a plea for the increased reflexivity for that reason. And the last thing I'd say, I always had a great difficulty, because I'm not a philosopher, of reconciling another definition of freedom which has always interested me, which is Hegel. For him, of course, freedom is recognition of necessity, with an existentialist definition. But I suppose that there is a point of reconciliation, because if one consciously analyzes the consequences of one's choices, then one begins to see the determinations which in the past have appeared to driven you in a certain direction, but now perhaps can be redirected, consciously redirected in new directions. But thanks again, anyway.
I actually kind of just want to speak to this idea of freedom as like reflexivity or a mindful freedom of choice of the things that you're actually doing. My understanding of existentialist philosophers and their understanding of freedom was that it was fundamental, and I think like the speaker was just saying, that there is no choice about whether you're making choices. We're fundamentally free. It's a base level of our reality. So we're always making choices even if we're not aware of it. So I wonder what the awareness really adds to the value of the choice when there's no avoiding it or making a difference with it. And then like there's the sort of potential upside of maybe a ecological improvement, but that seems to be dependent on whether or not we have sort of awareness of the ecological consequences of our actions, not whether we have awareness of the intentional consciousness of our actions, you know? I mean, so, yeah, sorry, I had a thing to say at the beginning and then it got more complicated as more things were said, but I think the basic point I want to make, or the basic sort of question I want to ask is whether reflexivity is a good thing or whether we should just focus on the value of a thing considered, let's say, maybe objectively. Because I mean, I just don't, I'm not seeing where reflexivity adds anything to the value of something.
That's a question for Tony, isn't it?
We have some people here.
It really is something that, I mean, you're right, it is an issue, and Tony was referring to events of a couple of years ago, and those are things we used then to debate, and I'm glad they're still now, being debated. It was one of the things I found difficult with the theorists you're talking about, that if the choice is always there, it becomes, big deal. Big deal. Okay, so it's there, it's there. But what Tony's talking about is, I think, a very different kind of choice. They're in a very different kind of freedom, and it's where that, you're right to say we're always choosing, but he's suggesting we might pay attention, we might be mindful of the fact that even when we claim not to be choosing, we are. We might be mindful and attentive and responsible for those choices we make, even when we try to hide from freedom.
If I can just say maybe one more quick thing.
That I just remembered from what I read I read The Stranger, and at the end he sort of comes to terms with his impending execution, and that seems to be kind of like that amor fati thing that Nietzsche spoke of, this idea that you just choose to love what is happening. And I mean, in The Stranger or The Outsider, he thinks about how great the universe is, even though he's a murderer and he's about to get executed. And I mean, if that's the case, it seems like maybe this becoming mindful and conscious of our choices and choosing our lives in this way could lead to, well, lives like Merceau's, which weren't very good. Yeah. He was a murderer and kind of a jerk.
Do you know Camus' little essay, The Myth of Sisyphus? Well, it's just a wonderful essay where Sisyphus is condemned by the gods. Camus speculates there could be different reasons for this, but he's condemned by the gods ceaselessly to pushing this rock up a hill, and it gets to the top of the hill and it goes down to the bottom, so he has to go down and get it. It's taken me longer to tell you this than the essay. It's only a 2-page essay, but it concludes with, Camus concludes the essay with say, so that's what Sisyphus has to do for all eternity. And the essay concludes with Camus' words, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I used to read that a lot. And it used to, like, it got me through hard times and made meaning of life and all that stuff. And one day I was having a hard time and I read this and I thought, in terms of the reconciliation with necessity, I said, using the Academy Award F word, right? This, and I had in a paperback with other essays, I acquired superhuman strength. I did something I've never done before. I defaced a book. But in this case, I tore the book. I tore the book in half again and again and again. And then I looked at this book and went, I still have that book. I put all the pieces back together, page by page, and Scotch taped them together. So I mean, the point of the story is, I'm sorry, Tony. Like I never could get reconciliation with necessity. I think there are some necessities we have to defy, and if somebody says that that's good, I still want to say no. It's oppressive and it's evil, but we don't have any choice.
I think you made my point. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a jock. But
I'm not a philosopher.
it seems that instinct and reflexes, trump free will.
I am a frustrated and completely failed student of meditation. So I do these classes and stuff. But the single best meditation class I ever did was with a guy who used to play for the Edmonton Wildcats. And it was really funny. I think I was the only guy in the room. There were a whole bunch of, young women who do yoga. And he was sitting there saying, well, what we learn in football is we have 4 milliseconds or 400ths of a second to react on how we're going to kill the guy. Yeah, thank you. And he used that as an analogy for mindfulness training, saying essentially, the training you do in learning how to play a sport to a high level means like training your whole body, including your mind, and controlling anger and controlling your wandering mind is much the same way. So I wouldn't draw too sharp a contrast between being a jock and being a philosopher.
Well, I'd like to pick up this question of the choice you reflect on and the choice you don't, which is, I think, a very valid issue. And I'd like to look at the case of John, and in fact, I'd like to interview John. Bishop John has now retired. And I asked him, well, how did you decide to be a priest? And John tells me, well, I really never had to make a decision. I knew I was going to be a priest. This is what I've always wanted to do. And I say, well, you must have been a pretty good priest. And he said, well, that they elected me bishop, and it's been an interesting and a full life. And I'm very happy with it. He didn't have to think very hard, or perhaps at all. And yet we feel that he has made a virtual choice, and he made the right choice. However, in another world, I interviewed John, who is now known as Juan, in Argentina, where he fled after having absconded with the parish funds and lives with his mistress.
Well, there's one good thing in the story.
John, did you have to make a choice? And he said, well, no, I just, I went ahead with what they wanted, but then I wanted something else, so I did a few things differently. And maybe, frankly, John has made it a virtual choice, and he made the wrong one. He could have decided something different. I'm not sure whether reflexivity of choice is the whole story, because I think there are real choices that are made without thinking and can still be right or wrong in terms of an excellent life. May I stop there and invite comment? This is a fascinating topic, Don. Thanks very much.
Could I ask a question to two people? And you guys, can I? See, I didn't understand this. Part of the question goes to Tony and then back to Nicholas. I didn't understand reflexivity that you were talking about to be something that was like head heavy. I understood it now, but it was your concept, and you put it into the discussion, and I think you like elevated the discussion immensely with it. So I wonder if you would sort of speak to that part of it. Does that reflexivity have to involve like something like this, or could it be involved in the example that Nicholas was giving?
Before I answer that, can I share one other observation with you? You were talking about Sisyphus pushing rocks up. And I remember going into a washroom in Trafalgar Square one time, and going into the cubicle to do my business, and saw a piece of graffiti on the wall. And this was a very high drug area. Lots of narcotics were being traded and exchanged. And the graffiti on the wall says, Sisyphus was a pusher. And it was just at the time that instead of having hand towels, they started to have these hot air blowing machines. And there was a graffiti on top of that. You can tell the time it was, and the graffiti said, for a 5-minute speech from Margaret Thatcher, push the button beneath. But to get back to your question,
yeah, does anybody remember the question?
Reflexivity. The kind of thing I had in mind, you know, and I'm not an expert on this, and I hate paying lip service to all sorts of different philosophers and such like, but the German philosopher, social scientist, Jürgen Habermas, kind of has this paradigm, if you like, in which he suggests that there is a kind of a discourse that we can use where, if we use the example he uses, the analyst and the person who is being analysed in a psychotherapeutic situation. The patient goes to the analyst, and the patient describes and demonstrates certain symptoms that the patient has, and maybe it's some kind of obsessive neurosis, some kind of hysterical condition. And hopefully, by going through sessions with the analyst is able to explain the reasons that generate, the causes that generate this particular condition in the patient. And so the patient is able to make a step beyond the situation that he first came into. He's able now not only to obviously experience the symptoms, but now to understand the causes. And so in this kind of reflexive sense, the kind of behavior that before seemed to be obsessive and driven can now, with an understanding of the causes, be redirected. In sense, Habermas says this is an opportunity for personal liberation. So reflexivity can go either way. It's no guarantee of virtue, that's for sure. But it is a guarantee, if anything, of more transparent process of living one's life. I just finished reading a book by Nicholas Carr, and he argues, whether he's right or not, that immersion in the internet and going on the web all the time has actually changed the neuroplasticity of the brain in certain ways. Not in ways which, not irreversible ways, but nonetheless in observable, scientifically observable ways. And this neuroplasticity has kind of started to program us for extended periods of partial attention and surface reading, rather than periods of intense attention and depth reading. So we are, in a sense, our brain structure is being kind of subtly changed by the technology of the information systems. So, I mean, that's one example of knowing that. Then presumably our decisions to use the internet can be more reflexive. That doesn't mean we give it up, but it means that we compensate for those periods that we're watching the screen with other periods in which we read, books in the old-fashioned way, simply to retain the ability for depth reading and depth understanding. So I'm not sure if I've addressed fully what you were answering, but that's my idea of reflexivity, to make transparent the consequences and the actions that we perform.
And as I understand that, now it's over to Nicholas, if I may, because as I understand that the Bishop Don, or the Juan, was it Don Juan, has, neither of them have the reflexivity in their lives in the way that Tony was describing. They're not unaware, but they haven't gone through that process. Okay, so now we both agree they can be good lives, but I have a question for you, which is underneath you. See, I'm inclined to think that one of our distinguishing and ennobling capacities is the capacity to take a step back from our lives. I'm afraid that I think we tend to do that mostly in times of stress and distress, when it's not going to have the effect that I'll mention in a moment. But because then we're trying to fix things or solve things or tell a story to make some pain go away. But we also have the ability just to wonder about what it is we're doing, what makes sense of it, where it goes, what it might mean, and how it might be. That's a whole lot lower down than the kind of thing that I think that Tony was saying. But I mean, like, for me, that's, I'll be dogmatic, but for me, that's like a core, crucial element of an excellent life. I personally, if something happened to me that I was unable to do that, I would regard my life as drastically reduced.
I just want to add a little twist maybe to this question of reflexivity and awareness of our choices. I think I got married very young, in my 20s, and if you ask me, was that a choice that I made really reflexively, or did I really have an awareness of what I was committing to? Absolutely not. And I would answer the same thing to my choice to have children. Did I make that choice with, yes, it was a choice and it was an awareness, but I guess the piece I want to get at here is, to me, where life becomes excellent is when you have a certain amount of faithfulness to the choices you've made. So maybe I had no idea what I was doing when I made this commitment. Maybe our friend the bishop here had no idea of really what that choice would mean. But the question of, really reflexivity and awareness for me comes down to the moment you do start to realize, whoa, what this is going to cost me. There's an element of saying, but you know what? And that's a choice again. I'm going to choose to be faithful. I don't know if that's the right word, but the covenant or the choice that I've made, I'm going to be faithful to this, even though I had no earthly clue what I was getting into. So I don't know if that's helpful.
It's got to be a crucial element of simple authenticity in life. I mean, starting with the view that you just accept that things aren't always going to turn out beatifically. I'm still not finished with Nicholas, though. I guess other people want to speak, but I'll just say, if I had a chance to ask him another question, maybe I'll just serve this up for the thought or something. See, when you didn't interview either of these guys, especially Bishop Don, you didn't interview him the way I would have, I think. Now, I happen to know he's an historian, and I'm a political theorist, so maybe that will reflect. But the question I would want to ask him is, what was it like? Like, I would even want to be a little rude and say, what were the fulfillments in that life, and what were the dark nights? And the reason I'm asking that is because certainly if there weren't fulfillments, and if the dark nights weren't tied to potential fulfillments, then it's not for me going to be an excellent life, whatever else it is. So what I'm suggesting back to you is, I would myself want to know more than, did you like it? Was it a good ride? I'd want to know more about, like, did it engage things in you? You can't use that kind of language with our Bishop Don, but so I'd have to get a theologian to find a way to put it to him. But was it fulfilling? And did it fulfill things in you? Were there surprises that were surprise fulfillments? Things of that sort. For me, that's way more important than, well, and did you choose it? And were you conscious of making that, I mean, in that sort of conscious choice every day when you got up?
Well, I'll really have to go back and conduct those interviews again in both of those virtual worlds, because I think your point is actually a good one. And if I were asking the bishop, I would expect him to say something like, "Yes, I've seen my people in my diocese well served with a spiritual counsel and fortitude, and perhaps if I went and spoke to Juan, his alter ego, he'd say, well, yes, I had a hell of a good time. I never really had to choose. I just did what I felt like, and it was good.
Yeah,
but your interview may be more searching than mine. So.
Okay. I just want to call to mind the idea of sanctions on choice, because we've looked a lot at choices where you have options and choices where you don't have options, but I want to look at choices where, regardless of whether or not the choice would be positive for you, about the suffering that it might cause you or it might cause other people. So like hard choices, like say Bishop Juan absconded with some money, but it was like no one really suffered necessarily directly because of that, and he obviously hasn't suffered too much because of that. So this came to mind when we were talking about, say, a woman in an abusive relationship.
Yes.
Might be able to say, I'm consciously making the choice to stay in this relationship because A, I have children, I can't afford to leave them without a father, or I'm going to be scorned by my community for leaving my husband for whatever reason. So I don't have a point to make as such, I just want to bring that to the table. How much, if you're choosing bad decisions for good reasons, does that make your life more or less excellent?
I think that's wonderful. I really, really think it's wonderful because I'm not sure this is where you were going with it, so let me say where you took me with it. So despite my joking protestation, I am a philosopher. I love Aristotle. I love thinking about these kinds of questions. And we very quickly get into issues about, well, especially, some of you may know Annabelle Lyon was in town this last week at Grant McEwen. She's the author of a book on a fictionalized biography of Aristotle and Alexander called The Golden Mean. And that particular book sort of ends in a way that one of Aristotle's own books on the excellent life ends, with a sort of choice between a life of contemplation and on the one hand, and a choice of immersion in the community, perhaps like Bishop Don might have led. Where I'm going with this is, I teach that, I read it a lot, I think about it a lot, but it's a life under ideal circumstances. And it leads us to think about the excellent life as the life under ideal circumstances. I'll tell you, all of that has led me to distinguish between the excellent life and what I call, for want of a better word, the admirable life. And the admirable life is the person who knowingly gives up some elements that they know would be deeply fulfilling because of a commitment to other people. Now that's not quite the example you put, but the reason I'm taking it that way is, again, I mean, choice freedom of choice isn't really involved here. What's involved here, I mean, the fundamental thing in these issues, I believe, has to be attention to what matters. Right? And in this is a case of where a person can be looking at acting in a way that will set up a life that would be really fulfilling for her, but would violate something that matters. And I admire that intensely, and so the reason I'm picking up on just that part of your question, and I'll invite you to restate the question in a minute, but the reason I wanted to pick up on it is it's really, really important. And we too easily get to thinking about these as, you know, abstract choices away from the people whose lives they are and whose costs they must bear. Did I misrepresent you?
Oh, no. No, not at all. I don't really have any real statement to make, but I guess what's coming to mind from what you just said was that I think choices to an excellent life, I think that freedom of choice is a privilege that not everyone has.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Is basically what I was getting at.
And without, it goes back to the very first question that you raised before, where I would not for an instant deny that there's genuine oppression there. But what I want to say is, like in the case of that woman may be making a choice that makes of her an exemplary human being, a wonderful person. And that's, for me, that stands out way beyond anything about choice, value of choice, or anything of that sort. In a way, the choice she doesn't make is what distinguishes her as a really wonderful woman.
The path we take, as was mentioned, is something that is predestined, something that we can perhaps have very little direct effect on, and the idea that we are in fact the masters of our soul, etc., is just an illusion.
What do you care to respond to that metaphysical dilemma?
Tweedale is teasing me. He knows I'm allergic to metaphysics. But I have a question as an allergen. Is, like, where does that go? Like, what does that mean in terms of what I do next?
I'm sorry, it's not meant to be metaphysical at all.
I know, that's him.
Bad Martin. I guess where that's meant to go is that the way we look at ourselves and our actions needs to be, perhaps, if you assume that we don't have choice, just for the moment, then, you know, how is it that we actually act the way we act? And if you think about that, that opens up, you know, very many different scenarios in terms of the kind of space we live in. And that all of our actions, you know, need to be very differently understood and interpreted.
So could I don't know whether you would disagree with this or not. I would like to reiterate something I said before, that it's not fundamentally important to me that it be chosen. The absence of oppression is important, but that it be chosen isn't what matters fundamentally to me. What matters is whether it's fulfilling, fun, worthwhile, things like that. And it seems to me, you know, we could all be flecks in a cosmic dream of necessity or not, and that those issues would still be true. Is it fulfilling? Is it fun? Is it worthwhile?
I agree. And wasn't it that Aristotle also believed that slaves, you know, who basically would be choiceless individuals in the standard idea of choice, could live an excellent life? No?
No, Astrid. Sorry. You don't have Aristotle on your side today.
And we won't talk about women either.
We won't talk about what?
Women either.
Oh, well, right. Naturally not. You know, I think it is time to take a break here, and everybody can refresh their drinks and come back to this difficult problem of responsible choices or non-choices, or reflexive choices or non-reflexive choices. So, Steeps is ready and willing to serve you, and we'll be back with more discussion in about 20 minutes. We'll resume this discussion on freedom of choice and the excellent life. I wonder if in your discussions with each other, maybe you've come up with a new line or point of departure for this whole discussion. Who would like to lead off here?
Don, thank you very much for your comments before. I want to come to it at a little bit of a different angle. I think most people assume that sort of unrestricted freedom of choice is a good thing. And I like Cicero's comment a long time ago that we're slaves to the law so that we may be free. And we live in community, and what makes our life excellent is our relationships. And I think that our choices impact other people. And we often, when we're living in community, we often have choices, and the choices we make may be offensive to others. And accordingly, in society, then, we have politicians who put parameters around our choices, and as Cicero would have it, so that we can be free. As a physician, I see many people whose lives have been less than excellent because of regret about choices they have made in the past. So I think, we can make choices for ourselves that are good and bad, but also the fact that there are parameters around our choices in many senses protects us from, as Aristotle talked about, human nature at times. So I'm curious for your thoughts as a political theorist. How should politicians set the parameters for our choices? And by what standard do they set those parameters? In the past, sometimes they're according to theological standards, but now in a multicultural, sometimes mutually exclusive value society, how should politicians set those parameters?
There, Don, you could answer that one pretty quickly, can't you?
Quickly. Yeah, you wanted the subject changed, Martin. You got a subject. Well, that's really two questions, I want to say. Like, one is a question about the state's direct role in the form of prohibition and restriction and permission. But the other, behind that, though, I think we might want to wonder about the community's role broadly in tolerating, enabling, permitting, educating, encouraging. I say that for a couple of reasons. Some of this goes back to a couple of earlier sessions. I think, first of all, we use the word state too much and the word community not enough. A lot of the restrictions we have are community-based, and when the provincial government acts to pass legislation, it does claim to be doing it on behalf of and for the community of Alberta, not as some abstract entity in the sky. But the reason I want to sort of stress that, and I will come to I'm just not comfortable talking about restrictions and laws all on their own, particularly when it comes to human development and human growth. So now to your question, the one clear thing we have to have is restrictions that protect people from the injurious acts of other people, right? So I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think I'll say frankly, I don't think it sanely can be debated that no one should have the right to injure another person, period. To inflict harm on them. But then after that, it gets really murky. And it's exactly at that point that I think the discussions then need to be brought down to a smaller level, like away from the legislature, away from the Parliament of Canada, more into the city, more into the neighborhoods, and that we need, I believe, to spend put a great deal more attention into education, and pay less attention, really, to outright drawing lines in the sand. Now, that's the form of an answer. It's not an actual answer. But the final thing I would say is, on your point about regret, I wonder whether people, whether when you say people's lives are less than they might be because of the regrets they have, I hope that's not true. I hope that they've done wrong things, that they regret that they've done the wrong things, and that their lives are less than they might have been because they did wrong things. That said, again, like, I don't want to get all like antsy about that, because like, you can't lead a worthwhile, challenged, engaged life unless you do some things that are probably going to be just really stupid. So long as you can avoid, if you can manage just to be stupid to yourself and not to people around you, that's an achievement. But that's, like, that's not a question of law. That's a question of encouragement, I think.
Your comment with regards to, yes, we need some maybe basic fundamental parameters in terms of harm, but rather than focusing on more parameters, we need more proactive education. The concern there, of course, then comes into what do we educate, and from whose fundamental values are we educating? Because when you're proactively educating, you're educating along a certain direction, along a certain belief system, right? Yeah. And so who then, and ultimately the government is overseeing that as well, right? They're determining the policy about education and curriculum and things like that. So if we're going to proactively educate, how does a pluralistic society form common values by which it educates? Because in the absence of those values, which is what is commonly happening now, where people are saying, okay, we'll leave values to parental units because we don't have common values that we can teach in schools, right? Is that often things like fundamental values and philosophy and theology and those kind of things that have been so dear to our lives in the past are being disregarded. So what is becoming the God, so to speak, in the current world are things like science. And so often scientific decisions are being made, such as with reproductive technologies, in the absence of humanity. So who decides in a pluralistic society what you're going to educate about?
I agree with so much of what you say, but I also disagree with a number of the suppositions, and I'm a little bit. But I think what you're saying is so important. Let me just say, without trying to speak directly to any of the specific things you said, just mention a couple of observations. And the first is, I disagree with you, and I think with some others here, I think possibly David and possibly Martin too, in that I don't think it's possible to have value agreement in a modern community. I don't even think it's desirable. I like the fact that there are people who really get off on things that I've never encountered before. I really like that, right? And at the end of it, if I ask them, why do you like that? Why do you like, what's some examples? So, like book clubs. You guys are in book clubs. You must know people whose... Holly, you're not allowed, my wife's not allowed to say anything about some of my tastes. But I have some tastes in books that are simply appalling, right? But, I bet if we sat and talked about it for a while, I could make some of these books sound interesting, vice versa. So the first thing is, I personally think it's a mistake to look for commonality and unity on these things. What we do want to look for is respect. That's you'd be quite right. It's nice that you smiled, because if you were just to go, oh come on, that garbage, I wouldn't blame you for it. But if we go to respect, we can think of. I think there are some aspects of a life that we could agree are important, although we might disagree about how they should be developed. I don't think our community or our education system begins any longer to introduce kids into the joy of reading and being read to. Okay? If you gave me a choice between, if the only way we could find time for teachers to read to the kids in their schoolrooms for 2 half-hour periods a day, if the only way we could afford that was to take computers out of the schools, it's a no-brainer for me. One of them is, and why? Right? Well, some of it is replaceability. The skills that you get on the computer, they're going to get anyway, right? But awakening the kind of capacities that go on, I think, when kids or some kids are read to, and like that's important. So I would focus on that, and I think there's, now we can disagree on how this would work, but I would say generally being able to say when Aristotle was born isn't going to make a particle of difference to anybody's life except Martin's. Right? But learning how to read a text by Aristotle, if you have that interest and ability, that can be enormously important. So, like, I want to see that kind of shift. And so where I'm going with this is there's a range. Like, I don't think this list of capacities that I was talking about that would be engaged in a well-lived life, I don't think it's a very long list. I don't think we'll ever get like agreement on all the details. But I'll just mention a couple of things that like we could do. One is I would like schools to pay a little bit of attention to lifelong physical activity. I don't know. Maybe they do that now, but like when I went to high school, we were taught to play sports that nobody can play after they're 30, right? And like that's just insane. So that's one. Lifelong physical activities, not hard to do. Sense of humor, right? Is that hard to do? No. But is it important? Yeah. Who's going to disagree with that? Well, I mean, say, I think I've got high ground here. Hands up, everybody who thinks that a sense of humor is not important in life, right? Who's going to, oh yeah, I don't think it's important. So I want to shift it. I want to shift attention more toward these elements. And when I'm doing that, I have two things in mind. It's not going to work for everybody. But, you know, when you look at kids who are going to get in trouble, if they were just having so goddamn much fun doing stuff, maybe they wouldn't get into trouble. One of the most interesting books by a Canadian in political philosophy was written by a guy who was a professor at Oxford. And in the preface, which I only happened to read, because, you know, we never read prefaces. It's not going to be on the exam. But in the preface, he remarked that when he looks back to when he was 11 years old, he can see, he's writing now from his chair in Oxford. He can look back to when he was 11 years old in Montreal, and he can see that he was then the kind of kid who was going to grow up into being either a university professor or a criminal. And he doesn't say why. He just leaves it to you to imagine why. And I think that's a really important point. If we did like more attention to engagement, development, maybe a little less emphasis on rules, maybe a little less attention on rules that are passed down to us from on high, from Ottawa, and a little bit more about generating the rules and practices out of discussions we have in rooms like this. And so the final thing I would say is, you know, when you were talking about the Hill and the legislature, I've been involved in politics now for a long time. And like I'm amazed at how little time it takes an elected politician to become exquisitely preciously self-important. And I won't hear anybody criticize politicians. I think I hate it when I think it's a terrible thing to take shots at politicians. But what I mean about the self-importance is that the way we do things now is like, it's over there, they're cut off from everybody else, so they're going to sit there and look at policies that come up from a bureaucracy that doesn't engage the community. Right. Well, I look around the room here, I see people whose hair is frequently the same color as mine, and I suppose that indicates a degree of wisdom and life and reflection on it, and a sense of what mistakes there are and what mistakes are worth making and so on. And see, that's where I would go. I will now confess that I did everything I could to change the subject from your question. Your question to me was, what laws and rules should there be? And I acknowledge that that's important, it's got to be done. I'm more concerned about the other important things that aren't being done at all. And when they're not done, we're not going to get good laws. We might have laws that look good on paper. They're not going to work in practice.
I'm not sure exactly what your intention was at the outset of asking that question, but I have a sort of interpretation of what it might mean. The idea that certain kinds of values might lead to regrettable lives, and certain choices about what you value might be actually quite bad, and perhaps there are reasons for either the government or society or somebody to sort of, not prohibit, but maybe circumscribe the values that people hold. And I think the things that you were talking about seem kind of like, they were all sort of adornments on an already functional life, like what kind of books someone reads, you know? I mean, some people have distasteful or bad taste in books. I'm one of them, certainly. But the values that I think are perhaps things that the government or somebody might want to get involved in, I'm thinking of things that lead to lives like drug addiction and crime and so forth. And there are values underlying this. Things like, I mean, I'm just going to go out and party and do drugs and do all this sort of stuff. That's kind of a values issue. And, you know, these are things that, I mean, there's a much more serious argument for policies there than things like what kind of books you read.
Well, I'm going to invite you, if you would, to make some of that more serious argument, because I'm going to absolutely categorically disagree with what you just said. Out of respect, I mean, I really, but I'm going to, see, I want to speak back to you as somebody who, like, I was never, like, you know, I wear glasses. I was never a tough enough kid to be the criminal alternative to the university professor that Jerry Cohen talked about in his book. But I did say I've never met a rule I liked. Okay. I'm convinced that there's the kinds of kids that we're talking about here. I mean, what do I know? I'm just maybe talking about myself and some kids I grew up with. I'm convinced if you tell those kids, don't read the Bible, we'll have it memorized by tomorrow night. Right? Don't study the violin. Right? We'll have young menuins in no time. Like, I don't mean to be flip about this, but I totally don't see this policy of prohibition as working. I think what might work is if we could unleash the grandparents. Right now, like, I don't know about this because I didn't have grandparents in my life, so I don't know how to, and I don't, as a result, I'll tell you frankly, I'm sorry to have to say this about myself, but I didn't have grandparents in my life, so I don't know how to be a grandparent myself, and I've really effed up a couple of times as a consequence. And I want to generalize from that, because we can look at kids from certain family backgrounds and we can say the last person in the world we want anywhere near that kid is their ex-con drug-dealing grandparent. And I go, I think I want the grandparent there. I really want, that grandparent will care about the kid and will have some savvy stuff to say. And yeah, the grandparent's going to say a lot of things that we don't want the kid to know. The kid's going to hear it anyway, but they might hear some stuff about how to live a decent life, and whatever it would be. Now, I said I was going to push back, and my reason for pushing back at the start, I said, was to invite you to make the case that you were promising.
Right, I think you make a good, I mean, I'm not really advocating, I guess, like a government sanctioning of values or so forth. I think it really does depend on a sort of strong community pressure on these things, which, I mean, the problem is there is a definite policy interest in doing this, and I'm not good enough at policy development to figure out what you would do. I mean, it clearly isn't something like you would teach in schools. You're not going to have, I don't believe in, you can't have a class on, don't do drugs. That's not going to work for people who are growing up in a community.
Here's how you don't do drugs.
Yeah, here's how you don't do drugs. Sit here and there's no needles around, you're fine. But maybe I'll push back on your example about the ex-con drug dealing grandpa. Perhaps maybe you're presuming that this grandpa has learned from his mistakes and is going to say, hey kids, this is a bad way to do things. That's not always the case. Some people lead sort of bad lives and they are admired for those bad lives. That happens. That seems to happen in these communities that have these sort of dysfunctional situations. And so what do you do about that? I mean, it's a really tough question. And I think the answer is kind of cheap, but it's sort of, the communities have to have a different set of values, but, how do you get them to have a different set of values to get the different set of values?
I have a bias on this, I have to tell you, because, and a bias means a kind of violence that alters, distorts your perspectives. I'll tell you frankly, I think maybe I'm speaking out of a kind of special experience that amounts to ignorance, or, like experience in a small case that leads you to be unaware of a whole lot of other things. When I was a university student, and like that, I worked for a period as a community organizer. This was, but remember, some of you may remember the Company of Young Canadians. I was involved in a set of projects that was before the CYC, but in fact partially led in to the Company of Young Canadians. And in the course of this, I met a man who ran a iron working shop in the community, who was an ex-con, who became a mentor to me. He had been in prison for manslaughter. It's a long story, I'll spare you this, but he kind of liked me, but he also thought that I was, I think, looking back, I think he probably thought I was kind of exotic and precious, like, he kind of dealt with me all the time as though, how could any person know so much about so little? See, because that's the way he would treat me all the time. Yeah, you can quote Kant and Hegel and so forth, he said, but, and I will be grateful, like he's one of the 3 or 4 most important people in my life. Because he opened my eyes to all kinds of things. Now, maybe that's unusual, maybe that's exceptional, but it certainly has led me to say, like, what he did more than anything else was to stop worrying about myself and just open my eyes to what was going on around me. I wouldn't claim to have been successful in that, but I mean, I just find it, frankly, very hard to believe that an older person would actually be around young persons if he or she didn't have some liking for them, right? I will say, like, frankly, I find really little kids boring as shit. They just bore the hell out of me. I mean, kids that, if you can't breastfeed them, what do you do with them? Well, you can change their diapers. How interesting is that, right? So with all of my grandchildren, step-grandchildren, and step-step-step-grandchildren, I keep waiting for them to start to talk, and then start to think, and then start to read, and start to read stories, and then it gets more fun. And I find I like them more the older they get. But I like them. Okay, now, so maybe I'm a crummy grandfather father or whatever. But my point is that I find it hard to believe that this person would actually be around the little kid's life if they didn't like them. And if they didn't like them, then like that's awfully important to start with. Just an older person who thinks you're neat.
Hi, I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you said before and that people have been saying about kids and living an authentic life. They've done some studies to show that kids, when they're around 5 years old, 95% of them think they're great. By the time they reach grade 12, it's about 12%.
Oh.
And that's shocking. And you talk about your students who won't say anything because, you know, they want to know the main points and everything. We've created that because we only mark them on when they regurgitate back what we think is important. We do not support authentic thinkers. From the time we're very, very small, if you think or you behave in a way that creates censure from, first of all, your family, then to a larger group of people, you are not validated for that. And one of the things with the whole resiliency literature and what makes a difference in a person's life is that you are validated for who you are. Not when a person says, oh, you can't think that. How can you think that? Well, I've had that said to me, like more than once. And you have to be a very strong individual to take that constantly as you're growing up without anybody around you who says, yes, you're great. I had Mr. Honey next door, who I used to go to, and he thought I was lovely and he would listen to me. And, I think all children, as we're growing and when you're older, you need, well, they call them protective factors. You have to have resilience inside you, but you also have to have people along the way, teachers, whatever, who will reward you for trying to find your authentic life. You talk to little kids, they actually have some sense of the essence of who they are. And we as a culture, once we start, I have a very simple mind. I think once we start appreciating every individual for who they are, accepting and celebrating them, we will have a very different world. We will have people who aren't pushing to exercise their ego or their whatever to feel important over other people because they know that they have value.
I didn't know. I appreciate the statistic. I didn't realize it was as bad as that. And I'm wondering, does it keep going down after? So when you get to 68? It's all over, right?
Actually, there's some very positive stuff too. That kids who are born in where there's very stressful, like addictions, all of that kind of stuff. The studies that show that when they're small, things aren't looking too good. But if they encounter protective factors, there's a longitudinal study done by a Canadian woman, Emily Werner, I think is her name, and her cohort is around 55. And there's a higher percentage of them doing well in their lives now than what there was when they were children because they had some interventions that were positive.
Wow. I imagine you guys in the back didn't hear that. And
sorry.
So would you restate it? Especially the longitudinal studies,
yeah.
Especially.
I was talking about, I think the lady's name is Emily Werner, who's done a study on kids who were born into stressful families, like with addictions and child abuse, all that kind of stuff. And the stats weren't really good when she sort of looked at them when they were 10, 15 years old. They were only about, I can't remember, it was only about 17% of them that were doing well. But her cohort is around 45 or 55 now. And the numbers have increased. It's around 45, 55% of them who are doing well in their lives because they had some of the interventions, the positive things that needed to happen for them. So it's really, when we do what we know to be right in some instances, which is put, positive things. And a lot of these kids are kids who grew up in very addictive, with parents who had addictions and all that kind of stuff. So it's really quite positive in some ways.
And I'm dying to add, I have one friend who says to me fairly often, he said it more than once anyway, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Why? Why do you think that? Right? And that's a world of difference from being told you're stupid.
Exactly.
You know, and
or you have no value. How can you
yeah,
do that?
yeah. So no, she was agreeing.
I was agreeing.
So we have moved, in a way, we have moved, I think, far away from, although with despite your efforts, to move far away from the focus on freedom of choice, and I think we're talking a great deal more about kinds of freedoms and ways in which we can open them up and provide support for those kinds of things in one another. I would say not just kids, although especially there. I sure as hell need it.
I'd like to actually bring it back to that.
This is trouble.
In the course of doing it, I'd like to disagree with what you said at the very beginning. And I mean, all the things we've been talking about can all be seen as giving young people the confidence to exercise their faculty of choice, and giving them the wherewithal to exercise it in a deliberative way, a way that Nick was talking about before the break, and in a reflective way, like Tony was saying, where you look back at what's influencing your choices, where are these choices coming from, etc., and bring that all into bear. But isn't that, all right, I'll go out on that. Isn't that really a necessary element in living an excellent life? That is to exercise that capacity for making choices in a deliberative and reflective way. I mean, and I'm not just talking about silly little choices.
Yes, of course.
Right, about book clubs. All right, and
you might not think.
But you know, I mean, choices about really what you're going to do with your life and how you're going to treat other people.
I just want you to say a little bit more about the choice part of this. We agree that we want people to act reflectively and with deliberation and with mindful regard for the world and people around them. So we want people to act in those ways, right?
Right, but I mean, I think there's other dimensions to this, like the one Tony brought out, and that are really significant. I mean, and the thing is the claim would be, I mean, that in making these choices, you're taking responsibility for the way your life goes, rather than just letting it fall into some predetermined furrow, right? Mm-hmm. Like your original priest. Mm-hmm. That's crucial. I mean, I'm not saying the priest led a bad life, right? As I said right back in January, some quite good lives can nevertheless fall short of excellence, right? And I guess that's what I want to maintain here.
So, and I'm glad you came back to this John, this priest. So I take it you don't think there is enough reflection and deliberation in his life commitment for that to qualify as an excellent life.
That's right.
See, and I want to say back, there's always the possibility for reflection and deliberation. The fundamental thing for me, and I wonder if it isn't also fundamental for you, is whether it's fulfilling.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it may well be that, you know, a lot of things don't get fulfilled. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it is, you know, this business of my way. I mean, yes. In saying that it was my way, I'm taking responsibility for it, right? And that's necessary for an excellent life. Now, you may fail the excellent life in other ways, but It's not a sufficient condition, but I think it's still a necessary condition.
There's a. You guys want? Can we talk about this a little bit? Because there's a current philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who's developed a weird expression, volitional necessity, by which he means he's trying to refer to things which a person chooses, but chooses because they have no choice if they're going to be a certain kind of person or that kind of person. So, but to talk about volitional necessity seems a contradiction or an oxymoron. Where I'm going with this is I guess I want to say two things. I think those are really important. I don't think they're necessary for people to find their way into lives that genuinely are fulfilling. And more importantly, it seems to me, and maybe we disagree on this, or maybe I'm just speaking out of the limitations of my life, but it seems to me that the capacity for that kind of standing back from things and reflecting and deliberating is something that you acquire over your full lifetime. And so, I mean, for me, what's more important is, did the person wind up in a way of life that's fulfilling and where they develop the capacity to do exactly those kinds of things, to bring greater attentive reflection to what they're doing, so that when times of crisis come up, and because it seems to me it will be times of crisis, that they are then able to reflect on it in the way that you're saying. But I don't want to, I'll tell you personally why, but I don't want to require that of a person. Okay, so here's why. I've only held one job for the last 40 years. I came to U of A in 1970 for 1 year to work with one person. And on my way here, I stopped in Ottawa and was talking with a friend. We had a conversation about which he reminds me regularly. He's now like quite a famous philosopher. But he reminds me of this regularly because in the course of talking about this, I was quite excited about the position I was coming to, except for one thing: I didn't want to teach. And when he told me I was wrong on this, that I would really enjoy it, and I said, I'm really dreading having to talk to Plato about all those kids, but I can't wait for the other parts of the job, the thinking. Now, as it happens, teaching has been just an extraordinary fulfillment in my life, and I don't want to make too much out of it, but the fulfillment's not increased or diminished in any way by the fact that I didn't reflect on it and choose it from that depth. What was needed for excellence in my life was the capacity I had and the opportunity, but also then, because the qualities you're stressing, Martin, for me they're sine qua non of a good life, reflection, capacity. But I think they get called into play at different times. I really don't want to see the kids I love going around thinking about their lives in those ways, because I don't think they yet have the experience to do it. Oh, I thought you were going to,
No,
demolish me.
I've said enough.
One of the terms that we haven't used is maybe striving for a deep integrity.
Yeah.
And striving or choosing. I like Covey and what he's done in the 7 Habits, and 7 Habits for teens. Those habits, you take the opposite, they will give you pain and misery. You take those character ethics he talks about, they generally lead for everybody to contentment and success. So there's a real guidance and something for young people we talked about in ourselves. That's maybe more of a pragmatic look at what we talked about today.
What other way is there to talk about it? It is. Because I'm wishing Martin had kept going, because, see, I think you're right. I mean, and of the 3 character types I laid out at the beginning, I'm the my way. I really am. I mean, I'm absolutely the my way guy. So.
The Frank Sinatra School of the University of Alberta?
Well, not Frank Sinatra, but that's true. Okay. But it is pragmatic. There is a good meaning of the word pragmatic, working through. That's what life is, isn't it? Working through.
Does anybody want to have the last word? Because
my wife is present. My wife is present.
Oh, we have a person who wants to have the last word, right?
I grew up on the farm. My dad probably never heard of Plato, but his philosophy was, you can only stick out your arm until the other person's nose begins. So there are boundaries in life.
Yeah.
That's Mill's harm principle, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Right.
What?
So we're back to Mill. Okay.
No. Martin is crowing because you having the last word, so he thought, means that he wins the little argument we were having. Could I just, if that was the last word, I have to say, I've had so much fun today. I can't imagine a more interesting thing to do. It's just, again, I want to congratulate Martin and David on arranging this series, but I personally really want to thank you all for this session. I really mean it. It was wonderful.
And to you too.
And Don, you're perfectly welcome to come to any of these cafes, you know that. So, thank you all. There is an announcement I want to make. Oh, I'll let David make it about the thing later this month. The Roman Center at the King's. Oh.
I already did it. Just a reminder about the Symposium on Religious Perspectives on the Civil Life. If you're interested or know people who are interested, I'd appreciate you letting them know. The little brochure, the program for it is up here. Thanks again. You were all just terrific.
All right, and remember that we will not be having another cafe until April the 2nd. That's 4 weeks from today. Would you all please thank Steeps for serving us all that tea. And thanks again to Don for leading a really exciting discussion. See you in 4 weeks' time.
Thanks for getting us going.